Have you ever felt overwhelmed by the noise of life? The constant rush, the endless distractions, the voices from all directions. Sometimes it feels like there's no room to breathe, no time to reflect. But what if I told you that the key to true peace, true belief and true strength isn't found in the noise but in the silence? Believe in silence isn't just about quieting the world around us. It's about understanding that silence is where God often speaks most clearly. In moments of stillness, our faith is tested, strengthened, and transformed. Think about Elijah in 1 Kings 19:12, when he found God's presence not in the mighty wind, the earthquake, or the fire, but in a gentle whisper. It's in those quiet moments, when we stop striving and listen, that we hear God most profoundly. In your life, when the noise of the world fades away, what is God whispering to you? Are you giving space for Him to speak? The silence isn't an absence, it's an invitation. When you embrace it, you invite peace, clarity, and deeper trust. Write in the comments, "I trust in the quiet," as an act of opening your heart to the lesson of believing in the silence. If you're not subscribed yet, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any content. Let's get started. Number 1. Silence reveals strength. Have you ever felt the weight of the world on your shoulders? The noise, the pressure, the expectations. Sometimes it feels like everything is falling apart, and you're left wondering if you have the strength to keep going. Life can get so loud, so chaotic. The voices of doubt, fear, and uncertainty scream at you from all directions, and sometimes you just need a moment of quiet. But what if I told you that in those moments of silence, there's a strength waiting to be discovered? You see, silence is not empty. It's not an absence. It's a presence, a place where God often speaks the loudest. It's in the silence that you find the courage to face your deepest fears, the faith to overcome your toughest battles, and the power to rise above your circumstances. The Bible teaches us that in moments of quietness, there's strength that we cannot see, but it is very real. And it's in that silence that we truly begin to discover who we are and whose we are. When you read the Bible, you'll find that many of God's greatest moments of transformation happened in the quiet. Think about Elijah, the prophet who found himself on the run, terrified and alone. He had just experienced one of the greatest victories of his life, defeating the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. But now he was hiding in a cave, overwhelmed by fear and doubt. In 1 Kings 19:11-12, God tells Elijah to stand on the mountain, and it says, "The Lord said, 'Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by.' Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper." Elijah was expecting God to show up in the thunderous, earth-shattering events, but instead God spoke to him in a gentle whisper. In that silence, Elijah found his strength, not in the noise of the world, but in the quiet presence of the Lord. God didn't need to shout over the storm to be heard. His power was made clear in the stillness, and it's the same for us. Sometimes we are looking for God to show up in dramatic ways, but it's in the quiet moments, in the peace, where we find His voice and His strength. In our own lives, we often find ourselves overwhelmed by the noise. The world is so loud: social media, work, family obligations, the constant rush to do more and be more. And in all that noise, we lose sight of who we are and who God is. We become consumed by the chaos around us, and we forget that there's power in the silence. Isaiah 30:15 tells us, "This is what the Sovereign Lord, the Holy One of Israel, says, 'In repentance and rest is your salvation, in quietness and trust is your strength.'" In quietness and trust, there is strength, not in striving, not in the noise of the world, but in the peaceful surrender to God's presence. We don't need to be busy all the time to be strong. Strength comes from resting in Him. It's easy to think that we have to keep moving, keep talking, keep doing in order to be valuable. But the truth is that God often does His greatest work in the moments when we stop, breathe, and listen. Think about how much energy we waste trying to fill every moment with noise. Whether it's checking our phones, talking over others, or filling the silence with distractions, we often avoid stillness because it makes us uncomfortable. We think we have to be doing something to be valuable. But God's Word challenges us to embrace the silence, to sit in His presence, and to allow Him to fill us with the strength we need. In Psalm 46:10, God says, Be still and know that I am God. It's in stillness that we come to understand that He is God. In the quiet we are reminded of His power, His sovereignty and His love. When we stop striving and trying to control everything, we make space for Him to move in ways we can't even imagine. The silence doesn't make us weak. It actually reveals a strength that we cannot find on our own. Maybe you're going through a difficult time right now. Maybe your world feels like it's falling apart, and the noise of life is drowning out your peace. I want to encourage you today to embrace the silence. Stop for a moment and listen. Close your eyes and let the quiet remind you that you are not alone. God is right there with you, in the quiet, ready to give you the strength you need to keep moving forward. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just be still and trust that in that stillness, you will find the strength to face whatever comes your way. And sometimes, silence doesn't mean inactivity. It doesn't mean you're just sitting around doing nothing. It means you're choosing to quiet your mind, to rest in God's presence, and to allow Him to work in you. The strength you need doesn't come from frantic efforts or endless noise. It comes from a quiet trust in God's plan, knowing that He is always with you, even in the silence. In your quiet moments, God is molding you. He is shaping you. He is strengthening you in ways you don't even see yet. Your silence may not always feel powerful, but in God's hands it's where your strength is being built. Don't underestimate the power of the quiet moments. Don't run from them. Embrace them, because in that silence you'll discover a strength that is far greater than anything you could have imagined. And so, as you walk through your day, take time to stop, breathe, and find the strength in the silence. Let the noise of the world fade away, and let God speak to you in that stillness. You don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes all you need to do is listen, and in that quiet, you'll find the strength to carry on. Number 2, the power of unspoken faith. Have you ever been in a situation where words just couldn't express how you felt? Maybe you've been through a challenge, and no matter how much you tried to explain it, no one truly understood. Or perhaps there were moments when you felt so much pain, so much hope, or so much gratitude, yet there were no words big enough or powerful enough to capture it. In those moments, what carries you through is not the noise or the chatter, but something deeper, something unspoken. And that something is faith. Faith at its core is not about having all the right words. It's not about explaining every single thing or shouting from the rooftops about what you believe. Sometimes, faith is simply shown in the quietest, most unspoken moments of life. It's not in what you say, but in how you stand, how you hold yourself in the hardest times. It's in the deep, unwavering trust that God is working, even when you can't see it, hear it, or feel it. We live in a world that loves to talk. The noise is constant, and everyone has an opinion to share. We're constantly asked to explain ourselves, to defend our beliefs, to prove why we stand where we do. But what if I told you that the most powerful expressions of faith happen when we don't say a word? When we choose to stand firm in what we believe, regardless of what others say or do, that's where the true power of faith is revealed. The Bible is full of examples where faith was more than just words. Think about the story of Abraham. God asked him to do something unimaginable, to sacrifice his son Isaac, the very promise God had given him. Genesis 22:1-2 tells us, "Sometime later God tested Abraham. He said to him, 'Abraham, here I am,' he replied. Then God said, 'Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you.'" Now think about the silence in Abraham's response. He didn't argue, he didn't question, and he didn't try to reason with God. He simply obeyed. Abraham's faith wasn't shown in his words. It was shown in his actions, in his willingness to move forward in silence, trusting that God had a purpose, even when he couldn't understand it. And even though this was an intense test, the Bible tells us that Abraham did not waver in his faith. The most powerful part of this story is that Abraham didn't need to speak his faith aloud. His obedience in silence spoke louder than any words ever could. And as the story goes on, God provided a ram as a sacrifice, sparing Isaac's life. Abraham's faith, expressed in the unspoken, brought forth a miracle. You see, there is something profoundly powerful about the unspoken nature of faith. It's when we don't have the words, when we're faced with uncertainty, or when we simply don't know what the future holds, that our faith becomes its most powerful force. It's in those moments when we choose to trust without needing to explain, to believe without needing to understand, that we begin to see how God is at work in us. When we look at the life of Jesus, we see this same unspoken power of faith. There were many times when Jesus didn't have to say a word to demonstrate his belief in God's plan. Take the time when he was arrested and brought before the high priest. In Matthew 26:63-64, it says, "But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, 'I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God.' 'You have said so,' Jesus replied. 'But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven.'" In the face of intense pressure and accusation, Jesus didn't feel the need to explain himself in detail. He didn't defend his actions or try to convince anyone of his mission. His silence was a declaration of his unwavering faith in God's ultimate plan. His silence was powerful because it was a display of complete trust and submission to God's will. Jesus understood that sometimes the greatest expression of faith is not in loud declarations, but in quiet trust, in moments when you allow God to fight your battles for you. Sometimes we feel like we need to explain our faith to everyone around us. We want to shout about our beliefs, to make sure everyone knows what we stand for. But real, unshakable faith is often expressed in the quiet moments when we don't need to say anything. When we stand firm in our convictions, even when the world is questioning us. When we endure hardship without complaining. When we choose to forgive without expecting anything in return. When we choose peace in the midst of chaos. The Apostle Paul understood this deeply. He faced immense trials, imprisonment, and persecution, but his faith wasn't defined by his words. It was defined by how he lived, how he remained steadfast, even in the most challenging circumstances. In 2 Corinthians 4:8-9, he says, "We are hard-pressed on every side but not crushed, perplexed but not in despair, persecuted but not abandoned, struck down but not destroyed." Paul didn't need to explain his faith in the midst of his struggles. His life spoke for him. The power of his faith was not in his words, but in how he continued to stand firm, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. We often think that to be strong in our faith, we have to say the right thing or convince everyone around us that we believe. But in truth, our strength is found in our silent trust in God. It's in the unspoken moments when we choose to hold on, to trust, to obey, and to believe, no matter what. So, in the quiet moments of your life, don't underestimate the power of your unspoken faith. It doesn't always have to be loud. It doesn't always have to be explained. Sometimes the most powerful act of faith is simply standing firm in silence, knowing that God is with you, even when you don't have the words to say. In every quiet decision, in every moment where you trust without explanation, you are growing in faith. You are becoming stronger, not because of what you say, but because of the quiet, unwavering trust you have in God's plan. And in that silence, God's power is made known. Number 3, when words fail, trust speaks. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where words just didn't seem to work anymore? When no matter how hard you tried to explain, to comfort, or to make sense of things, nothing felt enough. We all face those moments, times when the weight of our circumstances is too heavy for words to carry. It's in those moments that we find a deeper power, one that goes beyond language, one that speaks louder than any explanation or attempt to control. That power is trust. There are times in life when words simply fail us, when tragedy strikes, when uncertainty looms, or when we're overwhelmed by fear or sorrow. We don't always have the right words to say. The pain is too great, the confusion too deep. But in those moments, something incredible happens. Our trust in God becomes the loudest expression of faith we can offer. In the Bible, we see countless examples of people whose words failed them in their hardest moments, but whose trust in God shone through. Take Job, for example. He lost everything: his wealth, his health, his family. His world crumbled before him, and he found himself sitting in ashes, covered in sores. And while his friends tried to offer advice, and while Job himself searched for answers, there were no words that could explain his suffering or give him peace. In Job 13:15, Job says, "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. I will surely defend my ways to his face." Job's words in that moment didn't explain his situation. They didn't give a reason for his suffering, but his trust in God's goodness, his belief that God was still in control, even when everything else was falling apart, that spoke louder than any explanation. In the silence of his pain, Job's trust became his testimony. It was a trust that wasn't dependent on understanding, on having the right answers, or on things going well. It was a trust that stood firm even when words failed. In our own lives, we often find ourselves in situations where no words can bring us comfort. We may try to pray, but our hearts are too broken and our words fall short. We may try to reach out to others, but they don't have the answers we need. In those moments, it's not our words that make the difference, it's our trust. It's trusting that even when we can't see the way forward, God is still there. It's trusting that even when the storm rages, we are held in His hands. We see this beautifully in the story of the woman with the issue of blood in Mark 5:25-34. This woman had suffered for 12 long years. She had tried everything, doctors, treatments, anything she could do to heal, but nothing worked. She was at the end of her rope, and yet she heard about Jesus. She knew that He could heal her, but she didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to shout her request or plead for help. She simply believed, and her faith moved her to action. In Mark 5:27-29 it says, "When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind Him in the crowd and touched His cloak, because she thought, 'If I just touch His clothes, I will be healed.' Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. Her words failed her, but her trust spoke louder. She didn't need to say anything to Jesus. She simply believed, and her faith was enough. In her silent trust, she found healing. This is the kind of trust that we are called to have, a trust that doesn't need words to prove its power, but is displayed in quiet confidence that God is who He says He is. In the face of our own struggles, sometimes all we have is trust. The world will tell us to have all the answers, to fix everything with our own effort, and to speak our truth loudly. But God calls us to something deeper. He calls us to trust, even when we don't understand, even when words fail us. Trust speaks in ways words cannot. Consider the life of David, a man after God's own heart. David faced countless challenges. He was pursued by enemies, betrayed by friends, and surrounded by uncertainty. Yet in the midst of all of this, David often found himself unable to express what he was feeling, but he knew where to turn. He trusted in God's ability to save, to provide, and to be with him in every trial. In Psalm 55:22, David writes, "Cast your cares on the Lord, and He will sustain you. He will never let the righteous be shaken." David's words were often filled with anguish, but his trust in God remained unshaken. Even in the midst of overwhelming circumstances, he knew that God was there to hold him up. When words fail, trust is what keeps us standing. There will be times when we find ourselves in situations where we can't explain why things are happening, or even make sense of the pain. We might not have the words to articulate our hurt or confusion, but that's when trust becomes the anchor for our soul. Trust isn't about understanding everything. It's about believing that God is in control, even when we can't see the end of the story. Trust is what enables us to endure. It's what helps us keep moving forward when we don't have the strength to keep going. It's the quiet confidence that even when words fail us, God's presence and power are still at work. In Proverbs 3:5-6 we are reminded, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight." In those moments when words fail us, trust is what carries us through. It's not in the explanations or the reasons, it's in the quiet confidence that God knows what He's doing, and when we trust Him, He will make a way. So when you find yourself at a loss for words, don't lose heart. Trust in God's faithfulness. Trust that He hears you even when you can't speak. Trust that He is working in your life even when you can't see it. When words fail, trust speaks, and that trust will carry you through the storms of life. Number 4, finding peace in the quiet. In a world that never seems to stop, how often do we truly find moments of peace? Our lives are filled with constant noise, people talking, notifications buzzing, the hustle and bustle of everyday life. We're constantly on the go, constantly distracted, constantly trying to keep up with everything. But in the middle of all that, have you ever stopped to ask yourself where true peace comes from? Real peace. The kind that isn't dependent on what's happening around us. The kind that settles deep in our hearts. What if I told you that peace doesn't come from the noise, it comes from the quiet? We live in a culture that equates peace with the absence of conflict. If things are going well, if life is easy, if everything is calm, then we say we have peace. But the Bible teaches us that true peace isn't about external circumstances. It's not about waiting for the world to quiet down. True peace comes when we quiet ourselves enough to hear from God and allow His presence to fill our hearts. We all need peace. We crave it. We long for it in our busy lives, in the middle of chaos, and when we're overwhelmed by the challenges around us. But too often we search for peace in the wrong places. We think peace can be found in achievements, in possessions, or in the approval of others. But none of those things bring lasting peace. The Bible points us to the only source of true peace, God Himself. In Philippians 4:6-7, Paul writes, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Notice that Paul doesn't say, when everything is perfect, you'll have peace. He says that when we turn to God in prayer and trust Him, His peace will guard our hearts and minds. This peace isn't based on our circumstances. It's based on the quiet assurance that God is in control, and He is with us no matter what we face. Jesus Himself understood the importance of finding peace in the quiet. In Matthew 11:28-30, He extends a powerful invitation to all of us. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." When we are burdened, when the weight of life feels too much to bear, Jesus invites us to come to Him for rest. This rest is not about physical relaxation, although that's important too. It's about finding peace in our souls. Jesus offers peace that goes beyond understanding, peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances, but comes from the quiet trust that He is in control. In the Bible, we also see the story of Jesus calming the storm. The disciples were on a boat, crossing the sea, when a violent storm arose. Waves were crashing, the boat was in danger of sinking, and the disciples were terrified. They woke Jesus up, and in Mark 4:39 it says, "He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, 'Quiet, be still.' Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm." The storm was real, the danger was real, but Jesus spoke to the storm, and it obeyed. Jesus didn't wait for the storm to pass before He spoke peace. He brought peace in the middle of the chaos. Sometimes we find ourselves in the middle of storms, whether they're emotional, relational, or physical. We can't always control the storms around us, but we can choose to trust that Jesus will bring peace in the midst of them. We don't need to wait for life to quiet down. We can find peace right now, in the quiet moments with Him. The peace that God offers us isn't the absence of trouble. It's the presence of His calm in the midst of it. It's the peace that comes when we step away from the noise, from the stress, and from the distractions, and we make space to listen to Him. In Psalm 46:10 we are reminded, "Be still and know that I am God." In the stillness we remember who God is. We remember that He is in control, that He is good, and that He is with us. It's when we pause and find those quiet moments with Him that we are able to experience the peace that only He can give. This peace doesn't make sense to the world. It's a peace that transcends understanding, but it's the kind of peace that can hold us steady in the midst of life's storms. I know how easy it is to be overwhelmed by life. We get caught up in the rush, the endless to-do lists, the expectations, and the pressure to do more and be more. But in those moments, we need to remind ourselves that true peace doesn't come from doing. It comes from being with God. It comes from pausing long enough to hear His voice, to feel His presence, and to trust that He is in control. When we take time to sit in the quiet, to reflect on God's goodness, we find peace that doesn't depend on our circumstances. We find peace that is steady, unshaken by the world around us. Peace that says, even if everything falls apart, I know God is still in control. Peace that says, even when the storm is raging, I know that Jesus is with me in the boat. And this peace is available to you right now. You don't have to wait for the world to quiet down. You don't have to wait for all your problems to be solved. You can find peace in the quiet moments, in the stillness of your heart, when you choose to trust that God is with you. So, take a moment today to find peace in the quiet. Step away from the noise, the distractions, and the busyness of life. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and invite God's peace to fill your heart. Trust that in the silence, He is with you, and his peace will guard your heart and mind, no matter what you're facing. Number 5. Embracing God's voice in stillness. In a world that never seems to stop talking, have you ever wondered if you could hear God's voice above the noise? Between the clamor of our busy lives, the constant demands of work, family, and the constant rush of thoughts and distractions in our minds, it feels like there's no room for God to speak. We hear from others all the time, friends, family, social media, and the news, but how often do we quiet ourselves enough to hear from God? How often do we give him the space to speak to us in the stillness? The truth is, God speaks in the stillness. His voice is often heard not in the loud moments of our lives, but in the quiet ones. And it's in these quiet, still moments that we have the chance to truly listen, to truly hear, and to truly understand what he is saying to us. In the Bible, we see that many of God's greatest revelations came when people took the time to be still and listen. One of the most powerful examples of this comes from the story of Elijah, the prophet, who was running for his life, exhausted and afraid. After experiencing a powerful encounter with God, Elijah found himself hiding in a cave. In 1 Kings 19:11-12, we read, "The Lord said, 'Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by.' Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper." Elijah was waiting for God in the dramatic events, the wind, the earthquake, and the fire. These were powerful signs, but God didn't reveal himself in any of those. Instead, he spoke in the gentle whisper, in the stillness. And it was in that moment of quiet that Elijah heard God's voice and received his direction. God doesn't always speak in the loud, dramatic moments. Sometimes he speaks in the quiet. He speaks in the stillness when we make space for him, when we slow down long enough to listen. It's easy to miss his voice if we're always rushing, always moving, always filling our lives with noise. But when we pause, when we embrace the silence, that's when we can hear him clearly. Think about how much we miss when we don't take time to listen. The world is filled with distractions. We have so many things demanding our attention. Our phones, our work, our responsibilities. But God is waiting for us in the stillness. He's waiting for us to carve out time to sit quietly and listen for his voice. Jesus often modeled this for us. He would withdraw from the crowds to be alone with God, to listen, to pray, to receive direction. In Mark 1:35 we read, "Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed." Jesus, the Son of God, took time away from everything and everyone to listen to his Father. He didn't let the busyness of life or the needs of the people around him drown out his ability to hear from God. If Jesus, in all his greatness, needed that time of stillness, how much more do we need it? But here's the thing. We can't expect to hear God's voice if we never make space for it. We can't hear from him if we are constantly filled with distractions. When we are too busy to be still, we miss the opportunity to hear his guidance, his comfort, and his love. But when we embrace stillness, when we quiet our hearts and minds, we open ourselves up to hear from God in ways we never could before. This stillness doesn't always mean silence in the traditional sense. It can also mean stillness of the heart. It's when we stop our anxious thoughts, when we cease striving, when we rest in his presence. And in that stillness, we find that God is already speaking, already present, already guiding us. Psalm 46:10 tells us, "Be still and know that I am God." This stillness is not just about quieting the outside world. It's about quieting the noise inside our hearts. It's about letting go of our worries, our need to control, and our distractions so that we can hear God clearly. When we allow ourselves to be still, we make room for God to speak. We make room for his peace, his wisdom, and his direction to fill our hearts. In those moments of stillness, God can heal us, guide us, and equip us. He doesn't always shout above the noise of our lives. Often, he speaks gently, and if we don't pause long enough, we might miss it. But when we choose to embrace the quiet, when we make space for him, we hear his voice more clearly than ever before. God is speaking to you right now in the stillness. It might not always be an audible voice, but it is a deep sense of his presence, his peace, and his guidance. It's in those quiet moments of reflection, of prayer, of being still with him, that he draws near to us. and in that nearness, we find the strength to face whatever comes our way. So I encourage you today, take time to embrace the quiet, find a moment to sit still, to silence the distractions, and to listen for God's voice. He is speaking, and He is waiting for you to make space to hear Him. In that stillness, you will find the peace, the direction, and the strength you need to navigate your life. God's voice is waiting for you in the quiet. Are you ready to listen? Number 6. Silence breaks the chains of worry. Have you ever been so consumed by worry that it feels like you can't escape it? The thoughts swirl in your mind, over and over, taking up space and leaving you exhausted. Worry has a way of chaining us, of trapping our minds in a cycle of fear and uncertainty. We try to fight it, we try to pray through it, but it often feels like the more we fight, the more it controls us. But what if I told you that silence has the power to break those chains? What if I told you that in the quiet moments, when we stop striving and trying to figure it all out, God can release us from the grip of worry? Worry is something we all face. It comes in many forms: fear about the future, anxiety over relationships, stress about work, or concern for our health and the health of our loved ones. And in all of those things, it's easy to feel like we are powerless. We try to control everything, to fix everything, but the more we try, the more tangled we become in the web of worry. But God doesn't call us to carry the burden of worry on our own. In fact, He invites us to lay it down, to find peace in His presence, and to trust Him to handle the things we can't control. One of the most powerful reminders in the Bible comes from Philippians 4:6-7, where Paul encourages us not to be consumed by worry, but to bring everything to God in prayer. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Notice that Paul doesn't say, "Don't worry because everything will work out perfectly." He doesn't promise that life will always be smooth or that every problem will disappear. What he does promise is that when we bring our worries to God in prayer, His peace will guard our hearts and minds. It's in that moment of surrender, when we stop trying to figure everything out, that God's peace takes over. The truth is that worry often comes from our attempt to control things that are beyond us. We think we need to fix everything, solve every problem, and make sure everything is in place. But when we try to control everything, we only end up exhausting ourselves. And we can't experience peace until we release our grip on the things we can't control. That's where silence comes in. When we choose to be still, to stop striving, we create space for God to take control and to bring us the peace we need. Jesus understood this struggle. He saw the worries that His followers carried, and He spoke directly to them in Matthew 6:25-27. "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air, they do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life?" Jesus doesn't minimize the real concerns we face. He doesn't dismiss the challenges, but He encourages us to take a step back and put our focus where it belongs, on God's provision and care for us. When we are consumed by worry, we are focused on the problem, not on the one who can solve it. Worry makes us feel helpless, but silence allows us to release that feeling of helplessness and to embrace trust in God's care. Worry thrives in the noise. It grows louder when we fill our minds with what-ifs and endless scenarios. But silence breaks the power of worry. When we choose to be still and listen for God's voice, we shift our focus from the problem to the solution. We stop trying to control everything, and we start trusting God to handle what we cannot. In the story of Jesus calming the storm, we see a powerful example of how silence can break the chains of worry. The disciples were on a boat, and a furious storm arose. The wind was howling, the waves were crashing, and the disciples were terrified. In their panic, they woke Jesus, who was asleep in the boat. In Mark 4:39-40 it says, "He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, 'Quiet, be still.' Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to His disciples, 'Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?' In the midst of the storm, Jesus spoke peace to the waves. He didn't shout or scream at the storm. He simply said, 'Quiet, be still.' And in that moment, the storm obeyed. The disciples, who had been filled with fear and worry, saw the power of Jesus' words. The storm was still, and so were their hearts. This story is a reminder that the storms of life can often fill us with anxiety and fear. But when we choose silence, when we stop the frantic worry and listen for God's voice, He speaks peace into our hearts. His presence in the stillness is what breaks the chains of worry. We may not be able to control the storms, but we can trust that God is with us in the middle of them, bringing peace to our hearts. Silence is not the absence of noise, it's the presence of God. And in that presence, worry loses its power. When we quiet our minds and trust that God is in control, the chains of worry begin to break. We don't need to carry the burden of anxiety. We can choose to rest in God's peace, knowing that He holds all things in His hands. So, the next time worry tries to take over your mind, take a moment to be still. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and release your fears to God. Trust that in the silence, He is at work. He is bringing peace to your heart and breaking the chains that hold you captive. Let go of the worry and let God's peace fill you, knowing that He will handle what you cannot. Number 7. In the silence, you learn to listen. Have you ever tried to listen in a room full of noise? The voices, the music, the background chatter. It all becomes so overwhelming that you can't hear anything clearly. It's frustrating, right? Now think about your spiritual life for a moment. How often do we try to hear God amidst all the noise of our lives? The constant distractions, the endless thoughts, the pressures of the world, they all drown out His voice. But what if I told you that it's in the silence, in the quiet moments, that you truly begin to hear what God is saying to you? In a world that constantly demands our attention, it can feel impossible to quiet ourselves enough to hear from God. We live in a culture of noise, phones buzzing, news flashing across screens, people talking, and our own internal voices never stopping. And amidst all that noise, we often struggle to hear God's voice clearly. We want direction, we want answers, but the clamor around us drowns it all out. Yet the Bible teaches us that God speaks to us in the stillness. It's in the quiet moments of our lives that we can truly listen. The psalmist in Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." Being still is not just about stopping what we're doing, but about quieting the noise in our hearts and minds. It's about tuning in to the presence of God, letting go of the distractions, and allowing ourselves to hear Him clearly. Think about the way God spoke to the prophet Samuel. In 1 Samuel 3, Samuel was just a boy, and he was sleeping in the temple when he heard someone calling his name. He didn't recognize that it was God calling him at first. He ran to Eli, thinking it was the priest who had called him, but Eli understood that it was God, and he told Samuel to lie down and listen. In 1 Samuel 3, 9-10, it says, "So Eli told Samuel, 'Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening."' So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling, as at the other times, 'Samuel, Samuel.' Then Samuel said, 'Speak, for your servant is listening.' God called Samuel 3 times, and each time Samuel went to Eli. But it was only in the stillness, in the quiet moments, that Samuel was able to hear the voice of God clearly. And when Samuel finally listened, God spoke to him directly. In the same way, when we quiet ourselves and make space for God, we hear His voice more clearly. We stop rushing, we stop trying to control everything, and we simply listen. In our busy lives, it's easy to fill every moment with activity. We feel like we have to be doing something all the time. We fill our schedules with tasks, our minds with thoughts, and our hearts with worry. But in doing so, we miss the opportunity to hear from God. We miss the chance to listen to His guidance, to feel His presence, and to receive His peace. Jesus often withdrew to quiet places to pray and listen to His Father. In Mark 1:35 we read, "Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house and went off to a solitary place, where He prayed." Jesus understood the importance of stillness. Even though He was surrounded by crowds, even though there were constant demands on His time, He knew that He needed to spend time in silence to hear from His Father. If Jesus needed that time to listen, how much more do we need it? In the silence, we learn to listen not just with our ears, but with our hearts. We make space for God to speak, and we allow His words to guide us. Silence is where we learn to recognize His voice. It's where we come to understand His will for our lives. And it's in that stillness that we find the answers we've been searching for. But listening requires more than just silence. It requires a heart that is ready to hear. We have to make the choice to listen. In John 10:27, Jesus says, "My sheep listen to my voice, I know them, and they follow me." The key to hearing God's voice is a willingness to listen. It's about tuning our hearts to His frequency, being open to what He wants to say, and being ready to obey. It's not enough to simply be silent. We also have to be receptive. We have to remove the distractions, focus on His presence, and trust that He will speak to us. When we make listening a priority, we begin to hear God in new ways. We hear Him in our prayer time, in our study of His Word, in the quiet moments of our day. We begin to recognize His voice in the small things, in the quiet whispers of our hearts. And as we listen, we grow in our relationship with Him. But it's not always easy. Sometimes silence can be uncomfortable. We're so used to the noise, the busyness, the constant input, that the quiet can feel unsettling. But in those moments, we have to remember that silence is not an absence, it's a presence. It's where we encounter God, where we allow Him to shape us and speak into our lives. So I encourage you today to embrace the silence. Make time to listen. Set aside the distractions, quiet your mind, and open your heart to hear from God. He is speaking, and He wants to guide you. In the stillness, you will find the clarity, the peace, and the direction that you need. It's in the silence that you learn to listen, and in listening you hear the voice of God more clearly than ever before. Number 8. The unseen power of quiet confidence. Have you ever noticed how some people just seem to exude confidence? They walk into a room and you can almost feel their strength without them saying a word. It's not because they're loud or boastful. It's because their confidence comes from a quiet, unshakable place deep inside them. They know who they are and where their strength comes from. And this kind of confidence is powerful. It's not a confidence that relies on circumstances or the approval of others, but one that is rooted in something much deeper. And what if I told you that this quiet confidence is something God calls us to have? In a world that often equates confidence with loudness and visibility, quiet confidence can seem like a rare thing. We're taught to speak up, to make ourselves heard, and to assert our presence in every situation. But in reality, true strength doesn't always need to be announced. Quiet confidence is the ability to stand firm, to remain calm, and to trust in God's power, even when everything around us seems uncertain. God calls us to have this kind of quiet confidence, confidence that doesn't depend on our own abilities, but on His. It's a confidence that comes from knowing that He is with us and that He will never leave us. It's a confidence that doesn't need to shout to be heard, but simply stands firm in faith, knowing that God is in control. When we look at the life of David, we see a perfect example of quiet confidence. As a young boy, David was overlooked by everyone around him. His father didn't even think he was worthy enough to be called when Samuel came to anoint the future king of Israel. But David's quiet confidence wasn't based on what others thought of him. It was based on his relationship with God. He trusted in God's plan for his life, and that trust gave him the courage to face Goliath, the giant that no one else dared to fight. In 1 Samuel 17:45, David said, "You come against me with sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." David didn't need to raise his voice or boast about his abilities. His confidence was in the Lord. He knew that the battle wasn't his to fight, it was God's. And in that quiet confidence, David defeated Goliath. His victory wasn't just in the physical battle, it was in the strength of his trust in God. This is the kind of confidence that God wants to develop in us. It's not about being the loudest or the most visible. It's about trusting God enough to stand firm in the face of challenges. It's about knowing that we don't have to fight our battles alone. In fact, God promises to fight for us. In Exodus 14:14, He says, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." The power of quiet confidence is rooted in our trust in God's presence and His ability to work on our behalf. It's a confidence that doesn't need to prove itself or seek validation from others. It simply stands firm in the knowledge that God is with us and that His power is greater than any obstacle we face. Another powerful example of quiet confidence is found in the story of Esther. Esther was an ordinary woman who was thrust into extraordinary circumstances. She was chosen to be queen, but her people, the Jews, were under threat of destruction. She could have cowered in fear, but instead she stepped forward with quiet confidence, trusting that God had placed her in that position for a purpose. In Esther 4:14, Mordecai says to her, "And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Esther didn't have to shout or demand attention. She simply trusted God's timing and his plan for her life. Her quiet confidence led her to take action when it was needed most, and God used her to save her people. It wasn't her loudness that made her powerful, it was her confidence in God's ability to work through her. When we face our own challenges, whether in our families, our workplaces, or our personal struggles, we can have the same kind of quiet confidence. We don't have to prove ourselves to anyone. We don't have to be the loudest or the most visible. What matters is that we trust in God's presence and power. When we do that, we can face anything with a quiet confidence that speaks louder than any words ever could. Proverbs 3:26 reminds us, "For the Lord will be your confidence and will keep your foot from being caught." This quiet confidence comes from knowing that the Lord is our source of strength. When we trust in Him, we don't have to worry about falling or failing. He will keep our feet steady no matter what comes our way. Quiet confidence doesn't mean we never face fear or doubt. It doesn't mean we never struggle. But it does mean that, in the face of those struggles, we can stand firm, knowing that God is with us and that He will guide us through. It means that, even when the world around us is loud and chaotic, we can remain calm and steady because our trust is in God. So the next time you face a challenge, remember that you don't have to fight it with loud words or frantic efforts. Trust in God's ability to work in your life and let that quiet confidence shine through. Stand firm, trust Him, and know that His strength will carry you through. In the silence of your faith, you will find the strength to overcome anything. Number 9. Faith grows in the absence of noise. Have you ever felt overwhelmed by the constant noise of life? From the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep, there's rarely a moment of true quiet. Phones buzzing, social media notifications, people talking, the demands of work, family, and so much more. It's easy to feel like we're always in motion, always moving, always trying to keep up. But in the midst of all this noise, have you ever wondered where your faith is growing? Does your faith grow in the busyness and the noise, or is it in the quiet moments when you stop, listen, and reflect? The truth is, faith often grows in the absence of noise. It's in the stillness, in the quiet moments, that we make space for God to speak and for our faith to deepen. We live in a culture that values productivity, busyness, and doing more, but faith doesn't thrive in the noise. It thrives when we pause, when we rest in God's presence, and when we make space for Him to work in our hearts. We see this principle clearly in the life of Jesus. He spent much of His ministry surrounded by people, by crowds, by needs, but He also understood the importance of retreating to a quiet place to spend time with His Father. In Mark 1:35 we read, "Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where He prayed." Even Jesus, the Son of God, needed to step away from the noise. He needed those quiet moments to recharge, to listen, and to connect with His Father. If Jesus, who had the strength and wisdom to heal, teach, and perform miracles, needed time alone with God, how much more do we need it? Our faith grows when we make space for God to speak, and that space is often created in the quiet. When we stop, when we set aside the noise and distractions, we begin to hear God's voice more clearly. We begin to see His hand at work in our lives in ways we may have missed before. And in those moments of silence, our faith is strengthened. Think about the story of Elijah, the prophet who faced incredible challenges and was overwhelmed by fear and doubt. After a mighty victory on Mount Carmel, where God sent fire from heaven to consume Elijah's sacrifice, Elijah fled in fear when Jezebel threatened his life. He ran into the wilderness, exhausted and discouraged, but it was in the quiet, in the stillness, that God spoke to him. In 1 Kings 19:11-12 we read, "The Lord said, 'Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by.' Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper." Elijah had been through a whirlwind of events. He had witnessed the power of God on Mount Carmel, yet here he was, hiding in fear. And yet, it was not in the powerful wind, the earthquake, or the fire that God spoke. It was in the gentle whisper. God's voice was not found in the noise and chaos. It was in the stillness, in the quiet whisper, that Elijah heard his call. In the same way, Our faith grows when we embrace the stillness. It's in the moments when we step away from the noise and distractions that we can hear God's voice, and our faith is strengthened. We learn to trust Him in the quiet, to believe that He is still working even when we don't see immediate results. We also see this principle in the example of Abraham. When God called Abraham to leave his homeland and go to a place he didn't know, he didn't have all the answers. He didn't know exactly what would happen, but he trusted God's call. And over time his faith grew. In Romans 4:20-21, Paul writes about Abraham's faith. Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. Abraham's faith grew because he trusted in God's promise, even when it didn't make sense, even when the noise of doubt and uncertainty surrounded him. His faith was strengthened in the quiet moments of trusting God, and in those quiet moments, God fulfilled his promise. The same is true for us. Our faith doesn't grow by striving, by trying to control every situation, or by seeking approval from others. It grows when we trust God in the quiet, when we stop trying to solve everything ourselves and simply rest in His presence. Faith grows when we stop filling every moment with noise and instead listen for God's voice in the stillness. It grows when we make space for God to work in us and through us without the distractions of the world. In Psalm 46:10, God says, "Be still and know that I am God." It's in stillness that we come to know God more deeply. It's in the quiet moments of our lives that we can reflect on His goodness, His promises, and His faithfulness. And it's in those moments that our faith is strengthened. So, take time today to embrace the quiet. Turn off the noise, silence the distractions, and create space for God to speak to you. Your faith will grow not in the chaos, but in the absence of noise. In the stillness, God will speak, and your trust in Him will deepen. It's in those quiet moments that God will show you His power, His peace, and His presence, and your faith will be strengthened beyond measure. Number 10. Strength is found in stillness. In the rush of life, it's easy to think that strength comes from action. Always doing, always moving, always achieving. We often measure our worth by how busy we are, how much we accomplish, and how quickly we can get things done. But what if the true strength you need isn't found in doing more? What if it's found in doing less, in the stillness, in the quiet moments where you stop striving and simply rest in God's presence? Our world teaches us that strength is about power, control, and constant movement. We are bombarded with messages that tell us we must always be in motion, always pushing forward, always fighting for success. But the Bible offers a different kind of strength, one that is rooted in stillness, in trust, and in surrender. It's in the quiet moments that we discover a strength far greater than anything we can achieve through our own efforts. One of the clearest examples of this comes from the life of Jesus. Throughout his ministry, Jesus was often surrounded by crowds, constantly serving, teaching, healing, and meeting the needs of others. Yet he knew that to remain strong and focused on his mission, he needed time away from the busyness. In Mark 6:31, after a particularly intense period of ministry, Jesus said to his disciples, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." Jesus didn't tell his disciples to keep working harder, to push through their exhaustion, or to strive for more. He invited them to rest, to find strength in the quiet. Jesus understood that true strength comes not from constant action, but from taking the time to be still and reconnect with God. In those moments of stillness, Jesus was refueled, strengthened, and prepared for the next step in his mission. This principle applies to our lives as well. We often feel like we have to do everything ourselves, like we have to keep moving, keep pushing, keep achieving to stay strong. But in reality, our strength is found when we stop and rest in God's presence. It's in stillness that we allow God to replenish our strength, to renew our spirits, and to refocus our hearts. The Bible reminds us time and again that our strength comes from the Lord, not from our own efforts. In Isaiah 40:29-31, we read, "He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint." God promises to give us strength, but it's not a strength that comes from our own striving. It comes when we place our hope in Him, when we rest in His presence, and when we stop trying to carry the weight of the world on our own shoulders. It's in stillness that we find the strength to keep going, to keep trusting, and to keep moving forward, even when life feels overwhelming. Another powerful example of strength in stillness can be found in Psalm 23, where David writes about the peace and strength he finds in the presence of the Lord. In Psalm 23, 2-3, he says, "He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul." David, a man who faced many challenges, battles, betrayal, loss, understood that true strength wasn't about powering through life's difficulties. It was about resting in God's presence, allowing him to refresh and restore his soul. It was in the quiet moments that David found the strength to face whatever came his way. When we are constantly on the go, when we are always trying to accomplish more, we can quickly become drained and overwhelmed. We begin to rely on our own strength, our own efforts, and we lose sight of where true strength comes from. But in the stillness, when we stop and rest in God's presence, we are reminded that our strength is not our own. It is a strength that comes from God, a strength that is renewed and replenished when we allow ourselves to rest in Him. Jesus offers us an invitation to rest in Him, to find strength in Him. In Matthew 11:28-30, He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." Jesus doesn't call us to work harder or to carry more. He calls us to come to Him, to rest in Him, and to find strength in His presence. When we stop striving and surrender our burdens to Him, we find the strength we need to keep going. The truth is, we don't have to keep pushing ourselves to the limit to find strength. Our strength is found in the moments of stillness, in the times when we stop doing and simply rest in God's presence. It's in those moments that we are filled with the strength that comes from Him, the strength to face whatever challenges come our way, the strength to keep going when we feel like giving up. So, today, I encourage you to embrace the stillness. Stop for a moment, breathe deeply, and allow God to refill your heart with His strength. You don't have to do it all on your own. Let God renew you, refresh you, and give you the strength to face whatever lies ahead. True strength is found in stillness, when we stop striving and simply trust in God's presence to carry us through. Number 11. The quiet miracle of patience. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where everything seems to be taking longer than you expected? Maybe you're waiting for a job opportunity, a healing, or a relationship to be restored. The world around you is moving fast, and you're just standing still, wondering when things will change. In those moments, patience can feel like a struggle. We live in a culture that values speed, immediate results, and quick fixes. But what if I told you that the most powerful miracles often happen in the quiet waiting, in the patience that is developed during those seasons of stillness? Patience is often seen as a passive virtue, something we simply endure. But in reality, patience is an active process. It's a choice to trust God, even when we can't see the results right away. It's a quiet, powerful act of faith. In the Bible, we see many examples of people who had to wait patiently for God's timing, and in that waiting, their faith grew stronger and deeper. One of the clearest examples of this is the story of Abraham and Sarah. God had promised them a child, but years went by without any sign of that promise being fulfilled. Abraham and Sarah were already advanced in age, and the waiting seemed unbearable. But instead of rushing ahead or taking matters into their own hands, they had to learn to wait patiently for God's timing. In Hebrews 6:15 it says, "And so after waiting patiently, Abraham received what was promised." The key here is that Abraham didn't rush ahead. He didn't try to make things happen on his own. Instead, he trusted God's promise, even when it seemed impossible. He waited patiently, and in that waiting, he experienced the miracle of God's timing. His patience was not wasted. It was in the quiet waiting that Abraham's faith grew, and he saw God's promise fulfilled. Patience isn't just about waiting. It's about what happens in the waiting. In those quiet moments of patience, we are given the opportunity to trust God more deeply. We learn to surrender our timelines, our expectations, and our desires to God. Patience teaches us to be still, to trust that God knows what He is doing, and to wait for His perfect timing. James 5:7-8 reminds us of the importance of patience in our spiritual growth. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Just as the farmer waits for the crops to grow, we too must wait for God's work in our lives. The farmer doesn't rush the process, and neither should we. Our patience is an active choice to trust that God is at work, even when we can't see it. It's in the quiet moments of waiting that God does some of His most powerful work in us. The quiet miracle of patience is that it transforms us. It shapes our character, deepens our trust in God, and strengthens our faith. In the waiting, we are not stagnant. We are being refined, just as gold is purified in fire. In Romans 5:3-4, Paul writes, "Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope." Patience is what builds perseverance, and perseverance builds character. As we wait patiently, God uses that time to mold us, to prepare us for the future He has for us. Patience isn't about enduring passively. It's about trusting God actively, knowing that He is working behind the scenes, even when we can't see it. When we are patient, we allow God to move in His timing, not ours. We stop trying to rush ahead and we let Him lead the way. This kind of patience requires a deep trust in God's sovereignty, in His perfect knowledge, and in His good plan for our lives. And when we choose to wait patiently, we are rewarded with the quiet miracle of God's work in our hearts and lives. Think about the life of Joseph. He was given a dream that one day he would be a leader, but his journey to that leadership was long and filled with trials. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. Yet, in all of this, Joseph chose patience. He trusted that God was with him even in the darkest times. And in Genesis 41:46 it says, "Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt." Joseph didn't see his dreams fulfilled overnight. It took years of waiting, but through that waiting he grew in wisdom, character, and faith. The miracle of patience was that Joseph was prepared for the position God had for him, and when the time came, he was ready to fulfill the purpose God had planned for him all along. In the same way, the waiting periods in our lives are not wasted. They are an opportunity for God to work in us, to teach us patience, and to grow our faith. While we wait for God's promises to be fulfilled, we can trust that He is preparing us for what's ahead. Our patience will bear fruit in due time. So, if you find yourself waiting for something, whether it's for a change, a breakthrough, or an answer to prayer, remember that God is working in the stillness. He is shaping you, building your faith, and preparing you for what's to come. The quiet miracle of patience is that, in the waiting, we grow closer to God. Our trust deepens and we experience His perfect timing. Patience is not just about enduring. It's about trusting that God is at work in the quiet moments, even when we can't see it. And when we wait with patience, we will see God's miracles unfold in our lives in ways we never imagined. Number 12. God moves in the unheard moments. Have you ever wondered if God is working when you can't see it or feel it? In the quiet moments of life, when everything seems still and nothing seems to be happening, it's easy to feel like we're being overlooked. We may pray, we may wait, but the answers don't come right away. The world moves at a fast pace, and sometimes it feels like we're stuck in the background with no movement, no progress, and no sign of change. But what if I told you that it's in these unheard moments, in the times when nothing seems to be happening, that God is moving in ways we can't even comprehend? Sometimes we think that God only works when we can see it, when things are obvious, or when we feel the ground shifting beneath us. We want the dramatic moments, the miracles, the breakthroughs, the clear answers to our prayers. But in truth, God often moves in the unseen, the quiet, the unheard moments. And it's in these moments that He is doing the deep hidden work that will eventually lead to something amazing. When you look at the Bible, you see countless instances where God moved in ways that were invisible to the human eye, but His work was still powerful. Take the story of Joseph, for example. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. For years it seemed like nothing was happening. It seemed like God had forgotten him. But the entire time God was at work behind the scenes, orchestrating events, preparing Joseph for a future he couldn't yet see. In Genesis 50:20, Joseph says to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph couldn't see God's hand in every moment of his life, but he trusted that even in the unseen, God was moving, and when the time was right, God revealed the purpose of all that he had gone through. The work that God was doing behind the scenes was far greater than anything Joseph could have imagined in his darkest moments. God is often working in the quiet moments of our lives in the same way. We may not see the results right away. We may not feel the changes happening, but just because we can't hear or see it doesn't mean God isn't moving. In fact, some of his greatest works happen in the silence, in the stillness, and in the times when we least expect it. Take the example of Elijah again. After he confronted the prophets of Baal and had that incredible victory, he found himself running for his life, discouraged and afraid. He fled to a cave, exhausted and overwhelmed. He asked God to take his life because he felt like there was nothing left to do. And in 1 Kings 19:11-12 we read, "The Lord said, 'Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by.' Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper." Elijah was expecting God to show up in dramatic ways, in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire. But instead, God spoke in a gentle whisper. The miracle wasn't in the loud, powerful events. It was in the quiet, the stillness, the unseen moments. God was moving in ways that Elijah couldn't hear or understand in the chaos of his own mind. But when Elijah listened in the silence, God's voice was clear. The same is true for us. Often we are waiting for the big, loud signs of God's presence, but his movements are sometimes much quieter than we expect. God is often moving in the background, working things together in ways we can't see or understand. It's in those unheard moments that he is shaping us, preparing us, and working on our behalf. It might not always be evident, but that doesn't mean God isn't at work. Isaiah 55:8-9 reminds us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." God's ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are beyond our understanding. Just because we can't see his movements doesn't mean he isn't working. In the silence, in the stillness, God is doing things that we cannot comprehend. And when his work is revealed, we will see that everything he did, even the things we didn't understand, were part of his perfect plan. Think about the way seeds grow. We plant them in the ground, and for a long time, it seems like nothing is happening. The earth is quiet, and we don't see any changes. But underneath the surface, the seed is growing, taking root, and preparing to break through the soil. Just because we can't see the growth doesn't mean it's not happening. God works in much the same way, sometimes in the unseen, in the quiet, and in the moments when we least expect it. In Galatians 6:9, we are encouraged, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." Even when we don't see immediate results, God is at work, and in his perfect timing the fruit of our faithfulness will be revealed. The quiet, unseen moments will eventually give way to the breakthroughs, the blessings, and the answers to our prayers. So, if you're in a season where nothing seems to be happening, where you can't see the results of your prayers or efforts, don't be discouraged. Trust that God is moving in the unheard moments. He is working in the silence, preparing you for something greater than you can see right now. Keep faith in the unseen work of God, and in his perfect timing, you will see the results. God is moving, even when you can't hear it or see it. Trust that his work is always behind the scenes, always at work, always preparing you for the next step in his plan. Number 13, trust that speaks louder than words. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where words just weren't enough? You might have had something important to say, something you needed to explain, but no matter how hard you tried, the words just didn't seem to convey the depth of what you were feeling. Sometimes the most powerful expressions of faith aren't spoken. They're felt, they're shown, and they're lived out in ways that words could never fully express. In those moments, trust speaks louder than any words ever could. We live in a world where words are cheap. Everyone has something to say and opinions fly around constantly. But the real measure of trust isn't found in what we say. It's found in how we act, how we stand firm, how we persevere even when the world around us is questioning, doubting, or trying to discourage us. True trust is demonstrated in silence, in stillness, and in unwavering faith, even when there's nothing to say. In the Bible, we see that the strongest expressions of trust often come from actions, not words. Think about Abraham. God called him to leave everything behind and go to a land he didn't know, promising him that his descendants would become a great nation. Abraham didn't fully understand how God was going to fulfill that promise, but he trusted God. He didn't argue, he didn't question, and he didn't try to find a better way. In Genesis 12:1-4 it says, "The Lord had said to Abram, 'Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you.' So Abram went, as the Lord had told him." Notice how Abraham didn't argue with God or try to figure out the details. His actions spoke louder than any words could. He trusted God's promise and took the first step, even though he didn't know what the journey would look like. That trust was louder than anything he could have said. Similarly, when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, facing his impending crucifixion, his trust in God wasn't expressed in words, but in surrender. He knew what was coming, and in his agony he prayed in Matthew 26:39, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." Jesus could have used words to try to escape the suffering ahead, but he didn't. Instead, he demonstrated the depth of his trust by surrendering his will to the Father. In his silent surrender, he showed a trust so profound that words couldn't capture it. His trust was demonstrated in his obedience, in his willingness to walk the difficult path even when it was hard. Trust often speaks in the spaces between words. It's when we choose to move forward in faith, even when we don't have all the answers, when we step into the unknown, trusting that God will be there. We see this in the life of Noah as well. God told Noah to build an ark because he was going to flood the earth. Noah didn't question God's instructions. He didn't ask for more details. He simply trusted, and his actions demonstrated that trust. In Genesis 6:22 it says, "Noah did everything just as God commanded him." Noah's trust was not shown in grand speeches or explanations. It was shown in his obedience. He worked for years building the ark, even though he had never seen rain, and people around him probably mocked him for what seemed like an absurd project. But his trust in God's word was louder than any argument or doubt. His actions spoke volumes about his faith. When we look at our own lives, we often find ourselves in situations where we're unsure, where the words we have don't seem to convey what we truly believe or trust. But the truth is, our trust in God is best shown through our actions. It's not about saying we trust God when everything is easy. It's about demonstrating that trust when things are difficult, when life is uncertain, and when we don't have the answers. Proverbs 3:5-6 tells us, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight." True trust is demonstrated in how we live our lives. It's in our actions, our choices, and our obedience, even when we don't understand the path ahead. Trust is louder than words because it speaks to our core. It's a reflection of who we are and who we believe God to be. And when we trust God, we show the world that we believe in something greater than ourselves. We demonstrate the peace that comes from knowing that we don't have to have all the answers, that we don't have to figure everything out on our own. We can rest in the fact that God is in control and that he will guide us through whatever comes our way. So, when you find yourself in situations where words fall short, let your trust in God speak for you. Let your actions demonstrate your faith. When you trust God, your confidence in him is louder than any explanation you could give. Trust is shown in the way we live, in the way we move forward in faith, and in the way we surrender to God's will. And in that trust, we find peace, strength, and the assurance that God is with us every step of the way. Number 14. Silence tests the depth of belief. Have you ever been in a situation where everything seemed to fall silent, and you were left alone with just your thoughts, your fears, and your beliefs? In those moments, when the noise of the world fades away, it's easy to feel exposed. Our deepest convictions and beliefs come to the surface when everything around us grows quiet, and we're left with nothing but our own thoughts and the presence of God. It's in the silence that the depth of our belief is truly tested, not in the moments of action or triumph, but in the stillness where we are faced with the rawness of our faith. Silence has a way of stripping away the distractions, the noise and the busyness of life. In the stillness we are forced to confront ourselves, our doubts, and the reality of our trust in God. In those moments, the true strength of our faith is revealed. Do we really believe God will come through when we can't see the path? Do we truly trust that He is with us when we can't hear His voice or feel His presence? Silence challenges our belief and calls us to dig deeper into the foundation of our faith. One of the most powerful examples of this is found in the story of Job. Job was a man who had everything: wealth, health, family, but in one day he lost it all. His world was turned upside down, and he found himself sitting in silence, surrounded by the ashes of his former life. He didn't have the answers to why he was suffering, and his friends tried to comfort him with words that didn't make sense. In Job 2:13 it says, "Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him, because they saw how great his suffering was." For 7 days, Job sat in silence with his friends, who could only watch him suffer. There were no answers, no explanations, no words of comfort. And in that silence, Job's belief was tested. His faith was not revealed in grand speeches or dramatic moments, but in his ability to trust God in the midst of his pain. Job's deepest convictions came to the surface during the quietest moments of his suffering. Despite everything, Job refused to curse God. Instead, he wrestled with his emotions and his faith in a way that revealed the depth of his belief. In Job 13:15 he says, "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. I will surely defend my ways to his face." Job's faith wasn't just about what he could see or understand. It was about trusting in God even in the silence, even in the darkest moments. It was a belief that went beyond circumstances, and it was in that silence that his faith was tested and refined. Similarly, in the life of Abraham, his belief in God was tested in the silence of uncertainty. God had promised him a son, but the years passed and the promise seemed further and further away. Abraham and Sarah waited for decades, growing older with each passing year, and in the silence, the depth of Abraham's belief was tested. Would he still trust God, even when there was no sign of the promise being fulfilled? Would he still believe that God was faithful when the wait seemed endless? In Genesis 15:4-6, God spoke to Abraham in the stillness, assuring him that he would have a son. Then the word of the Lord came to him, "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." He took him outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." And then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Abraham's belief was tested in the silence of waiting. Even when everything seemed impossible, he chose to trust God. And it was in that silence, in the moments of waiting, that Abraham's faith grew stronger and deeper. His belief wasn't about what he could see. It was about trusting God's promise, even when there was no sign of it. The silence we experience in our own lives tests the depth of our belief in similar ways. When we face seasons of waiting, of uncertainty, or of suffering, it's easy to let doubt creep in. It's easy to wonder if God has forgotten us, if He's still with us, or if He will fulfill His promises. But it's in these quiet moments that God refines our faith. It's in the silence that our belief is deepened, our trust is strengthened, and our hearts are prepared for what God is going to do. Psalm 62:5-6 says, "Yes, my soul, find rest in God. My hope comes from Him. He is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will not be shaken." In the silence, we find rest in God. We find that He is our rock, our salvation, and our fortress. Our belief is tested, but it is also strengthened. In those moments of quiet waiting, we learn to trust God in ways we never could in the busyness and noise of life. So if you are in a season of silence, where the answers seem distant, where the path ahead is unclear, or where the waiting feels unbearable, know that your belief is being tested and strengthened. God is working in the silence, refining your faith and drawing you closer to Him. Trust that even when you can't see or hear His presence, He is still at work. The silence is not an absence of God. It is an invitation to go deeper in your faith, to trust Him more fully, and to believe in His timing and His plan. Your belief, tested in the silence, will be stronger than ever before. Number 15. Peace grows where silence thrives. In the hustle and bustle of everyday life, it often feels like peace is just out of reach. We are constantly bombarded by noise, people, technology, responsibilities, and worries, that it can seem impossible to find the stillness needed to experience true peace. We may long for peace, pray for it, and hope for it, but how often do we allow silence to create the space for it to grow? What if I told you that peace isn't something we have to chase? It's something that grows in the quiet moments, in the spaces where we choose stillness and rest in God's presence. In a world filled with constant noise, the idea of peace might seem like a distant dream. But peace, real peace, isn't just the absence of conflict or chaos. It's the presence of God in our lives, the stillness of heart that allows us to trust in His sovereignty no matter what's happening around us. And peace grows in silence. The Bible often speaks of the peace that comes from God, a peace that transcends understanding. This peace isn't dependent on circumstances, nor is it something we can create on our own. It's a gift from God, one that is most clearly experienced when we make space for Him in our hearts. Space that is often found in the quiet, in the moments when we pause and listen for His voice. Philippians 4:6-7 reminds us, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." The peace of God isn't something that comes through our own efforts or striving. It comes when we surrender our worries and let Him work in the quiet of our hearts. It comes when we make space for silence and trust that God will bring His peace into our lives, no matter how chaotic things may seem. Look at the example of Jesus, who in the middle of His ministry often withdrew to quiet places to pray and reconnect with His Father. He knew that true peace came from being in God's presence, away from the demands of the world. In Mark 1:35 it says, "Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place, where He prayed." Jesus understood that peace isn't just something we wait for to come to us, it's something we must make room for. It's in the silence, in the solitary moments with God, that peace begins to grow. By choosing to step away from the noise, Jesus was able to find the peace that would sustain Him for the challenges ahead. And we are called to do the same. Peace grows where silence thrives. One of the most profound examples of this comes from the story of Elijah. After a great victory over the prophets of Baal, Elijah fled into the wilderness, feeling alone, exhausted, and overwhelmed. He sought God in a moment of despair, but God didn't reveal Himself through the powerful wind, earthquake, or fire that Elijah expected. Instead, God spoke to him in a still, small voice. In 1 Kings 19:11-12 it says, "The Lord said, 'Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by.' Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper." It was in the silence, in the absence of dramatic events, that Elijah found the peace he needed. God's voice was in the quiet whisper, and it was there that peace began to settle in his heart. Peace grows in silence, not in the loud and chaotic moments. When we create space for quiet, we make room for God to speak, and in that space His peace begins to fill us. The truth is, peace is not something we can find in the noise. It's not something we can search for by filling our lives with more activity, more information, or more distractions. Real peace is found when we stop, when we breathe, and when we allow ourselves to be still before God. It's in those quiet moments that God's peace fills our hearts and minds. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." Peace grows when we take time to be still, when we step away from the rush of life and focus on God. In the stillness, we are reminded that God is in control, that He is with us, and that He has already won the victory. Peace is not something we have to chase. It's something that grows when we choose to be still and trust in God's presence. In the same way, the Apostle Paul, even in the midst of great trials, knew the peace that comes from God's presence. In 2 Corinthians 12:9, Paul writes, "But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me.'" Paul knew that true peace doesn't come from being strong or self-sufficient. It comes from knowing that God is with us in our weakness, that His grace is enough, and that in the quiet moments of surrender, His peace will fill us. When we stop striving and trust in His grace, peace grows in our hearts. If you're feeling overwhelmed by the noise of the world, by the pressures of life, or by the anxiety that surrounds you, I encourage you to find a place of silence. Set aside time each day to be still before God, to listen for His voice, and to rest in His presence. It's in those moments of quiet that peace will begin to grow. The peace that surpasses understanding, the peace that only God can give, will fill your heart and guard your mind. Peace grows where silence thrives. When you make space for stillness, you make room for God's peace to fill your life. Let go of the noise, rest in His presence, and trust that in the quiet moments, God is doing a deep work in you. His peace will sustain you, guide you, and bring you the calm you long for in a world that never stops moving. If you've made it to the end of this video, it means you are truly committed to understanding the power of silence and how it can transform your faith. Your dedication to exploring this theme shows your desire to strengthen your relationship with God and grow spiritually. The fact that you stayed until the end demonstrates your determination to apply this teaching in your life. Keep seeking that stillness where God speaks and allow it to deepen your trust and clarity. Remember that believing in silence is a continuous and rewarding journey. Every quiet moment you embrace will strengthen your faith and bring you closer to God's voice in your life. Here on the channel, we help people deepen their understanding of faith, offering forgotten teachings, inspiring stories, and practical wisdom to guide your spiritual walk. Comment "I trust in the quiet" so we know you made it here and are walking this journey with us. Thanks for watching, and keep seeking His peace in the silence.